Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2026 Annual Conference and Book Fair in Baltimore, Maryland. I am Chris Biak, a member of the AWP Board of Directors. I've served as Vice President the last couple of years, and I've been Secretary of the Board. I've really enjoyed my experience. The Association of Writers and Writing Programs is a small but mighty nonprofit organization that amplifies the voices of writers and the academic programs and organizations that serve them, all while championing diversity and excellence in creative writing. I'm a member of AWP's Board of Directors, but first and foremost, I'm a member of AWP because it provides these opportunities for writers. We invite you to become a member today. We are delighted to bring you this event today. I'd like to acknowledge and thank Alice James Books for today's event and their support of the conference. Our literary partners and sponsors allow AWP to present these extraordinary literary events and help us to keep our conference affordable and accessible. I have just a few reminders before the event. Respect seats marked as reserved for attendees with accessibility needs. Please give the authors about 10 minutes after the presentation to get to the book signing table before approaching them to have your book signed. That table is going to be outside this door and to the left. Thank you. And now it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Andrea Jurjević, who will introduce this fantastic event. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for being here, making me nervous. I'm honored to moderate this panel, and I wanted to begin with something personal. I grew up in Yugoslavia, a country that was established in the aftermath of World War II and that disintegrated 50 years later. During the wars in the 1990s, the borders were redrawn, official narratives shifted, and everything became contested territory. This includes textbooks, how we speak, what we call our languages, whether the Srebrenica massacre of 8,000 Bosnian men and boys constituted genocide, and even what we called the war itself. Homeland war versus war of aggression versus the international name, war of independence. To this day, some state-affiliated media and some politicians from the former Yugoslav region continue to promote narratives that reframe convicted war criminals as defenders of the nation. I learned early on that history is not neutral. It's written by those with power, and those without power often disappear from the historical record entirely. As a translator, I've spent years bringing poetry and prose from my first language into English. And this work, too, keeps reminding me that most literature never reaches the shores of the English language. And so many human stories and experiences are swept into the corners of unrecorded history. And this is something our panelists refuse to accept. They don't simply treat historical records as definitive fact. They look at the stories that exist in the gaps between official narratives. They ask who gets to be remembered, whose experiences count as history. They document, they reconstruct, they imagine, they use language and its prophetic properties to fill silences. They humanize what official records might otherwise reduce to footnotes. I will introduce the panelists, and then they will read some of their work, and then we'll have a little conversation. First is Tyehimba Jess, the author of 2 books of poetry, Lead Belly and Olio, winner of the 2017 Pulitzer Prize, the Anisfield Wolf Book Award, the Society of Midland Authors Award for Poetry, and received an outstanding contribution to publishing citation from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association. Jess, a Kavik Hanem and NYU alumnus, received a 2004 Literature Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts and was a 2004-2005 Winter Fellow at the Provincetown Fine Arts Work Center. Jess is a distinguished professor of English at the College of Staten Island. Leigh Sugar's collection Freeland, which came out last year, was a finalist for the Alice James Award and the Jake Adam York Prize. She created and edited That's a Pretty Thing to Call It, prose and poetry by artists teaching in carceral institutions, which came out in 23 by New Village Press. A disabled and chronically ill poet, Sugar has an MFA from NYU and an MPA in criminal justice policy from John Jay College. She's taught at the Poetry Foundation, the Institute for Justice and Opportunity, various prisons, and more. And Iain Haley Pollock, the author of the poetry collections Spit Back a Boy, Ghost Like a Place, and the recent All the Possible Bodies, which also came out last year. His work has received several honors, including the Cava Canem Poetry Prize, the Alice Faye de Castagnola Award from the Poetry Society of America, NYSCA, NYFA Artist Fellowship in Poetry, and a nomination for an NAACP Image Award. He directs the MFA program in creative writing at Manhattanville University in Purchase, New York. Please join me in welcoming Tyehimba Jess, Leigh Sugar, and Iain Haley Pollock.
All right. Hey, it's really an honor to be here today and to read some poems with this incredible family of poets. Alice James. I wanted to be published by Alice James. I really did. Things didn't work out that way, but you know, they work out the way that I can be here with them at this time. You know, I'm gonna this is about archives, and I've been reading writing some work that surrounds a kind of archive that I didn't realize was an archive, and that is the blues recordings that I have on my rotation that has shifted from device to device, that I listen to on a regular basis as I ride and walk the streets of New York, etc. And I realized, I've been listening to some of these cats for like 25, 30 years. All of a sudden, you realize, why haven't I written a poem about X, Y, Z? So I think that this is going to be about that. This first one is entitled Theodore Roosevelt Taylor, April 12th, 1915, December 17th, 1975. Also known as Hound Dog. Anybody know Hound Dog Taylor? Okay, well, look him up. Hound Dog once confessed, I can't play shit, but I sure make it sound good. Others just said he played the hell out that guitar. Yes, it's true, the hell was played out of his guitar on the daily, along with 500 miles of barbed wire wind whistle, a murder of crow caws, 20 pounds of brass knuckle jangles, and 40 acres of midnight cricket song. When he dragged the holler of his humbucker through wire and magnified coil, folks swore they'd heard the muffled motor rumbles of 7 funeral cars, the spinning chambers of 1144s, and the mother's murmured up prayers echoed off plaster cast praying hands. In short, he slid metal on string till the devil got tickled and laughed up the blues. Born a polydactyl, his 12 fingers flayed the 6 strings till one night he freed himself of his right hand's 6th nub, sawed it off, drunk on something loaded with more proof than sense. Each boogie he played held a secret line dance for the sacrificial digit, its spirit hovering up in the stratosphere, somewhere with his howl. In a distant forest, the monument to his reckless fretwork rustles in the treetops and hums with beehives like the watts in a worn, weary amp, burning, crackling for release. Hound Dog Taylor. Well, interesting guy. It was interesting researching the history of these folks. And here's one. This is another guy. I have a penchant for the harmonica players. This is a guy named Jerry Boogie McCain. June 8th, 1930 to March 28th, 2012. And the epigraph is, "For he who hung old harmonicas from his ceiling." Let's take a walk through Jerry's heaven of dead harmonicas. The mortuary of detuned mouth organs entombed in the air, dangling wire by wire from the festooned ceiling of Boogie's Alabama lair. All savored, sung, sposed, and hung out to dry. Spat out like hot cussin' to hang haunted from up high. The tiny tin bugles blown out and tortured with tooth scars. The blistered reeds bent to riddled question marks. Screws buzz-sawed loose by tongued arpeggios. Dime store diatonics and push-button chromatics coolly copper-combed. They trade dusk to dawn stories of biting the dust between his brooding lips. In a low-toned shuffle or a high, bright overblow that pierced the moon's fire-flied southern glow. "I've killed them all," the former bounty hunter boasts. He reaches for a fresh tin-hole saxophone to hold between his jaws and blow into shuddering tremolo. Each harp inhales and hollers Boogie's life story, breathes as his mouthpiece for all his good-loving and hoary lessons hard-earned. They'll warp themselves through warbles and wrenching bends. They'll hide in his hands, peeking through finger flutters till they can choke, sputter, grind to an end. Then a reverential ascent to hover from above. Here in this suspended cemetery, this rusty cloud of steel that drowned in the shove, pull, and peel of McCain's mellifluous lungs. Yes, they were all shiny once. Roaring and whining like a baby crying for bed. Then a whistle and a beg for a fine woman's leg, strutting all tough through a downtown Gadsden Avenue. Them harps got old quick, even when they were brand new. The hungry-hearted harpists chewed through every note they had to brew. And now, dear friends, Boogie's gone too. He blew his last note for the last tune he wrote in the improvised air around his head. He's joined his harps in the afterlife, or rather, the land of the not-so-dead. The realm of those led by their music to life lived luscious in the space between our ears. That's where his 78s still rotate, his shimmered up blues through our bones year after year after year. Where each harmonica still moans, resurrected from its rusted, broken fate. Where we shake ourselves sweaty in the boogie of McCain's graveyard wake. Where we're lifted ceiling high for a moment beyond our own weight. Jerry Boogie McCain. Go check him out. Check him out on YouTube. Write these down. just kind of kidding. I think I got one more. Time for one more. Yeah. This is another gentleman. This one was Well, I just got this one published in the world, but ever get a chance, it's another guy named Johnny Shines. Anybody heard of Johnny Shines? Well, amazing blues guitarist who, well, let's just say his slide guitar was just amazing. Where is the shrine to Johnny Shines? April 26, 1915 to April 20th, 1992. It should be thistle covered, a labor of thunder bent through it. It should fountain sweet water arcs into catfish mouth bottlenecks. It should flock blackbirds into halos about it. It should be wrapped in guitar string and whistle wind up in its branched hair of calamitous thorn. Above all, a rose carried in a pocket at least 100 miles. Beneath all, a 33 RPM orbit of diamond-cut tremble. Surrounding all, the record skipping on at least 12 echoing country yodels. I ask again, where is the shrine to Johnny Shines? I peeked into the dark, covering my eyes with its ethereal hands. And then, only then, did I hear.
Thank you. Leigh, would you like to go next?
Can you hear me? Thumbs up from the back. Thank you. Give me like a big wave if you can't, if that goes somewhere else. Thank you. I'm so honored to be here. Tyehimba, Iain, thank you so much. And Alice James. So Tyehimba was talking about archive in a way that I was not conceiving of archive, which is really exciting, and I sort of admire the digging into specific individuals of the past and looking at sort of where we are now and sort of what they've contributed is a terrible like reduction of what the work he's doing. And the archive, I guess, that I'm talking about also has to do with that. But I think there's a way of, all of our bodies are archives. And there's a way of talking about that in terms of, I'm so sorry. There's a way of talking about that in terms of a very individualistic approach, my singular body. And there's a way of understanding the body as both a reality and also a connection, a metaphor to the larger human enterprise. So that's where I'm hoping to engage with the archive in that way. I'm beginning with a poem called Ars Poetica. And I was also thinking how I think like all poems are Ars Poetica in some ways. And this is after Hermes, translated from the Arabic by Maged Zaher. It's from a collection called the Tahrir of Poems, which is a gorgeous collection translated by youth who were living through the Tahrir Square protests. And the writer wrote originally, I seek a poetry that detonates the body. And that's when I sort of vowed to never use bomb or detonate as a metaphor, because that's not a metaphor that's very real for many people. And I'm very lucky, and that's not a metaphor for me. I want a poetry that reassembles the body, that is, investigates love, how it is not enough. That is what prison taught me, teaches me. That is, I want to not be lonely. So Freeland is actually, it is kind of a maybe boring title, but it's named after a town in Michigan called Freeland, Michigan, which is home to the Saginaw Correctional Facility, which is a Michigan state prison, and the town is called Freeland. So that's where, yeah, the title comes from, which is its own history and archive, of course. Renamed from the native titles upon which it was stolen. This is Inheritance, after Natasha Trethewey, who is also a master of archive. In 1920, my grandfather received an American name. Zucker became Sugar, now my own last name. The Third Reich never tattooed on his forearm a number. I count myself lucky to have a last name. Each April, magnolias litter my parents' front yard before Michigan's spring blizzard exposes its silver face. My oldest friend's surname is Blessing. I know to consider possible prophecy when giving a name. At 8, we jarred petals with perfumes and spices to capture that early spring teasing embrace. I didn't, back then, know cinnamon from cedar. Those potions turned rancid on shelves, defined waste. These days, I scrawl 619754 on envelopes after a locked-up beloved's last name. He says, Leigh, I dream I've forgotten my number, and wake to realize I've forgotten my name. I have one short and then a poem to finish. And I was very tickled looking at Leadbelly last night, and there's a poem called Leadbelly in Angola, Down Again. And there's a quote from Tyehimba, nothing sound more American than Angola. This is called Recurring Dream. I sit down to write a love poem and end up writing a letter to my daughter, the daughter I don't yet have. Dear daughter, there is a prison in Louisiana called Angola. Angola, after the country the slaves who were brought to Louisiana to pick cotton came from. At Angola prison, there are chain gangs and a rodeo, too. Love, your mom. And then I teach her to count. Thank you. And I'm finishing with Ars Poetica Antipodes, which is not in the book. It's a newer poem, but I wanted to frame to Ars Poetica. So Antipodes, to my understanding, just means like the polar opposite of something. And the second title is I Want a Poem About, after Sam Sachs. I want a poem about a Palestinian child going to school in Gaza to not have to be notable, because what is more normal than a child in school? I want to see a photo of a Palestinian construction worker in Gaza and flip past, bored by the obvious. A builder building that thought would be, if even registered as thought. Or, why is this in a newspaper? It's just life as life happens. I want the poem by the grandchild of a Shoah survivor, oh, you may think, about transforming generational trauma, perhaps whisper shouting, never again. But reader, that is not the poem. Because in the poem, nobody knows she's connected to the Shoah because she doesn't mention it. And especially doesn't write Holocaust as if singular. The poem is just about buying flowers for her grandma. It's boring and, more importantly, poorly written. I want fewer headlines, fewer photos. I want less news, not because I'm tired, but because I want Palestine to be just another place on a map. A word allowed in the news, but rarely appearing because it's a country among countries. I want less countries, none ideally. I want a poem about no borders, one nobody understands because there are none. I type now on my laptop on a couch because I have one. A couch and a laptop each, I mean. It is not notable, this circumstance, plain as Midwest winter. These imagined poems all sound boring and bad, poor descriptors, I know, but forgive me, reader, don't read this poem. May this poem disappear into the bowels of neglected literary journals, stacks and stacks unsent, piled in academic offices, department libraries, recycling bins, unread. On another map, a mother in Gaza takes her child to the doctor for a routine vaccine. The child gazes outside the window, waves at the man in a hard hat repairing a street. A routine repair. The scene so boring you put the map away. The map so boring that, were the map a poem, you would have already turned the page. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm a high school English. I was a former high school English teacher, so y'all are gonna have to do better than that. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you to Alice James for asking me to represent the family. I appreciate it, and I'm honored to be part of the family. Thank you to Leigh, my fellow Alice. It's not every day that you get to read with one of your heroes. So thank you to Tyehimba for sharing the stage with us, for being a role model for my own work, and for once picking me up on the side of the road at my first Covent Garden residency. It's a long story. I'll tell it to you at the signing table if you swing by. First poem's longer, second poem isn't quite as long. Isn't it funny that we have to prepare people for the long poem? You're like, strap your seatbelt on, here we go. It's about an experience that I know to be common for, it's about a question, what are you, that is common for many multiracial folks or folks who are racially ambiguous. Is you is, or is you ain't? An answer becomes a set of further questions. What are you, you have asked me? You are either a male student whom I know but do not teach, and whose parents avoid racial conversation at the dinner table, or a woman in a Houston bar who has run her fingers through my dreads without asking permission. Whoever you happen to be, please clarify your question. Are you asking in the existential or the racial sense? My knee-jerk existential answer is, I am a human. I am a human constituted of the anatomical, emotional, physiological, historical, genetic, cultural, psychological, social complexity of our species. This human status renders a complete response to your question, what are you? Or more properly, who are you? I was that kind of English teacher, I corrected people. So intricate and expansive as to make the question functionally unanswerable in the time our encounter, which we both want to be as brief and casual as possible, allows. I'm willing to wager, however, that you're asking option 2, the racial question. And I'll double down that you're asking from within the narrow confines of an American construction that carries the racial residue no salt air could scour from the hulls of conquistadors and colonists' Atlantic crossings, such that your question bears a Victorian, at best, conception of race as its subtext. In that case, trying for a quick exit from the conversation, I'll say that as the issue of a white father and a black mother, I am a mulatto. Although, having seen the genetic data from my mother's mitochondrial mothers, I am something closer to a quadroon. But I would have to explain this term to you, extending our chat longer than either of us desires. So I'll leave my answer at the degrading and zoological original, part man, part pack animal. To move hypothetically forward in racial time, if you were asking your question from a place of conscious blackness, a latter-day negritude, I would answer, my mama's black as your mama, which may or may not be true. To create an authenticity that would, with any luck, bind me to you and evolve into a sense of belonging, such that I'd have some soft place to rest my head in this dirt-hard, fractured little America of ours. This scenario is not to be, though. Whoever you are, you most decidedly do not speak from a place of conscious blackness. Of course, I could try my most honest answer. In the history of recorded ideas and migrating peoples, no one has invented a category that precisely defines what, in your idiom, I am. The same could be said for you, I'm sure, had we time and want enough to wade into your genetic pool. If the world continues as it does to change and stay the same, I do not in my lifetime predict success in this definitional endeavor, and particularly not star-spangled success. By pointing to the paucity of categories precise in their definition of me, I do not reject love for my mitochondrial mothers, stolen as they were from their Gold Coast homes, shipped as they were across a body of water stretching farther than they imagined a body could stretch, enslaved as they were in Spotsylvania County, Virginia, for the purpose of producing Orinoco tobacco. Nor do I reject love for my father's Englishness. Although, were you and I desiring to engage for longer, we could scope the purity of this Englishness. Historical records and family lore suggest 19th century Pollock forebears were forced from the Scottish Highlands during the clearances, while the reddish tint of my father's beard suggests a Viking in the woodpile. The colonizer and colonized again rehearsing their psychodrama within the double helix of me. What am I? I am a whole that is equal and unequal to the sum of his parts, a liquid in a solid system, the undetected spectrum floating between fixed poles of a binary. I'm something while not being anything that humans, especially American humans, can understand. Picking up social cues, the clock has wound down on our encounter, and you are, as I am, eager to go our separate ways. You're late to geometry, or your boyfriend waits with a gin and tonic. But my ambiguity of speech in person might have threatened you. So let me retreat into civility and ask, did I answer your question? All right, you can take your seatbelt off. This one's shorter. A black mother's child considers his lost dream of immortality. 1. What was she hoping I'd learn? What lessons when my mother, who taught Greek at the college on the hill, read their old stories to me? To be ready one night for hooded snakes to crawl into my cradle, to leave a trail of twine behind me as I walked the labyrinthian corridors of my country, not to raise the wrong sail whenever I came home to her, not to dive as the swan and plummet into a woman bathing in the seclusion of high reeds, not to be the shock and awe of white wings. For me, though, the truth in the myth was this: power transforms into life and life forever. And when my mother was finished, all I wanted was to live as those changing but unchanging gods. 2. The white man who taught me Greek hated me. He thought I was lazy. I admit that I often slept through his morning class, often stumbled through his translations as a boar through deep sudden snow. My mother cried when she left me in the parking lot of that place, cried harder than I'd seen since the first week after her father died. I think she had learned that no black mother can save her children, save them as you have proven and are still proving, America, from your primitive, bullhorned violence. And so, more days than not, her son stood beside an aluminum keg, fermenting himself, pouring into his gullet a river not of forgetfulness, but of an urgent forgetting. 3. My mother wanted to learn Latin on her way to Greek, but the teachers had her pegged to cook and sew. Short but thick-set, the school's own former football hero, her father traded on his glory, the scars earned for it on his hobbled knees, the slight slur of his speech, to demand a place for her in a room of primers and chalkboards. They thought she should scurry about the rooms of your house, America, picking up what you had dropped. But she overcame to stand at the front of a room, professor of language and myth. I told a version of this story to black children at a school in Philadelphia. When I came to the end, my mother teaching Greek at the college on the hill, they rose from their chairs and applauded her through the proxy of me. I think now I lied to them while standing in a room across town from where you firebombed a city block to save yourself. America, you have eaten your children to keep your place on the honeyed mountaintop. If you have not already, you will consume these children too, and still you will come with wild, ravenous hunger for more. And why do you keep doing what you do? And what will you do one day when instead of a child, you swallow a stone? Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Let's pause once again. I'm going to stand here just because it's easier to do the sound. William Carlos Williams wrote famously, "It is difficult to get the news from poems," although I think that today it's difficult to get the news from the news themselves. And so I'm interested in how you guys think as to what poetry can offer in regard to documenting events that history, books, and journalism cannot. And also, how does our digital age, with its deluge of information and misinformation, affect the dominant narratives? How does poetry fit into this moment of time with journalism and history books and the digital media?
Wow. That's a lot in that question, isn't there? I have to frame that in the events of this past 7 or 8 days, in which it's quite arguable that we've entered World War III. And as I've been thinking about this panel, I'm also thinking about how that's being archived, how the historical record of these various events are being archived, and also how it's being censored in many ways. And I'm thinking about my own experience in working with archives. If I may elaborate, there's a lot of positive, and then there's the negative. The positive is there are things I can look up now that it would have taken me like 20 years, and or like 7 or 8 years to get a hold of the various documents, and I can get hold of them electronically via the internet, etc. Like for instance, a weird feeling is when I wrote Lead Belly. There was a film about him that I wrote about in the book, and I never saw the film. I saw the transcript
Oh my.
of the film, but I didn't see the film. And now that film is on YouTube. You know, and with Olio, I wrote about I wrote about a sculptor named Wildfire, who at the time I didn't know where she was buried. Nobody knew where she was buried. And then after the book came out, people found out in Monia Lewis, where she was buried in England. Anyway, that aspect is wonderful, but the issue is just as easy, just as all these documents and information are more readily available, they're also more readily available to be changed. And the way we understand our history is vulnerable to that kind of editing and changing. And so it's even the books that we read. I was reading the other day that what is it? The books you get on your phone, whatever, Yeah, Kindle. They will you can no longer download the book, so technically they could go back and change the text of the book, and you might never really realize that. I think it calls for a special attention to the way we develop our own personal archives. If we're particularly interested in ourselves and the events that happen around us and the events that we're interested in, is to start downloading or to have physical copies of these various historical records, because they can definitely be changed. And that's just part of what it will take to be to maintain a certain kind of, really frankly, sanity. If you see something happen in front of your eyes and you know it happened, or you saw it on tape, right? And then you go back 5 years later and you're like, wait a minute, that never happened. Wait, I know it happened. I know that I read this. How will you be able to prove that? So those are my thoughts at this moment, at this very precarious moment that marks another level in the decline of the American empire.
And I think that's, for me, why that mutability of the record and of narrative is why it's so important for poets to do their work, right? To bear witness and to be documentarians and to be record keepers and say, this happened, right? This is the counter narrative. History is often the history of the history we get handed down, right? That I learned in school was the history of the powerful, right? And I think poets can create a counter narrative to the history of the powerful. Even I was thinking about the work that in the poems that you read, right? The blues singers that got handed down to me, like Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, tend to be the folks who are on the Columbia label, who are making people a lot of money, who white middle class suburban Gen X Americans discovered, right? And like those are the folks that come down to us as the great blues musicians, right? But I don't believe in great men, and I'm sort of using that gendered language on purpose because I think people come out of cultural moments and historical moments, and for reasons of politics and power, some of them get held up. And I think poets can say, like, no, this was also happening. This was also what it was like to be alive at this time, in ways that are powerful. I also think in addition to the page, I think the community of poetry is very important in this moment. Bringing it to the contemporary moment, I think we're a couple weeks away from, of the 5 major news networks, 3 of them will be concentrated in 2 families, the Ellisons and the Murdochs, right? And who's going to be giving us the news? Who's going to be giving us the real news? And I think poets can do that through writing, but through also gathering in community with one another. I was hanging out with the poet Mitchell Douglas last night, who lives in Indianapolis, and he said, anytime anything happens in Indianapolis or in the world, the poets get together and read poems together, right, and talk it out. And I think that is the function that poetry plays right now. For me, is to bring people into conversation, to share perspectives, and to share life as it's lived, not as powerful people want us to perceive that it's lived.
Sure. I mean, I'm thinking sort of literally about docu-poetics and the lineage, and thinking of certain figures like Muriel Rukeyser and Ernesto Cardenal. And their work as as both of you are saying, is an observing and a telling of what is happening. And the best I or any single one can do is perceive, and perception is necessarily a lens that's inescapable, which I think for me feels like both a great tragedy and a great beauty of being a person. And so I guess I struggle with the idea of witness, because when I think of the word witness, that's connected to one's perception and observation, and how can something not be fundamentally changed by that lens through which one is witnessing or perceiving? And so, not to get all, I could word about this for a while, but I guess just this idea of an objective truth, which is, as Iain was talking about, which has sort of been sold to many of us who were raised in the States and under the public or private, whatever education, as sort of this textbook is the objective truth. And we all know that, the truth is told by the winners and the oppressors and the people in power, etc. And I'm also not objective, and I'm not suggesting some platonic truth, and it's not like an issue of not trusting one's witnessing or one's reporting or one's telling, but it's just, I think one of you used the word simultaneity, and it's that collection of, if we'll use the word witnessing, or all these perceptions, and that's what creates the portrait of what's happening. That was a lot of words.
Yeah, that's one so interesting. I teach documentary poetry, docu-poetics, and students oftentimes end up saying how much they learned from the poetry books about stuff they never learned about in their history classes. I'm dreaming of teaching a journalism poetry class where this is the case, but we'll get there one day. All of your books engage with these broader public narratives, and yet each one feels very, very intimate. And I am curious where that begins for you, or how you actually manage to strike that balance. How do you speak about how you navigate when you lean into the personal and when to focus on the public? How does that work for you in the process of making?
I don't see a binary between the personal and the public for me, and I think part of it is because I've never had a choice. Like, I'm I think there's an ambiguity to my racial identity as I was trying to explore in the poem, but I think I'm very visibly other, right? And I think that visibility creates a publicness to how I navigate through the world. I think that Black folks in America, our bodies have been politicized again and again and again, and now, right? So I don't have a choice to sort of sit back in a private, personal space. Like, I hear some people argue that, like, from that stance, you can't write about trees and flowers, and I don't hang with that. I don't jive with that, but because I think even when I'm doing that, there's an argument about my humanity and my engagement with the world and my ability to get beyond the parochial mindset and worldview that has been like thrust upon me in many ways. So even if I'm just trying to raise my kids and enjoy nature, I think there's necessarily in America, there's a political act to that, and I'm aware of the politics of it. I mean, I do think in the strictest sense, political poems advocate for a change, right? And I think there are times when I'm writing poems that are suggesting that change needs to be made, and sometimes there are poems where I'm just trying to live my life. But I think in some ways, all of those poems are political for me.
These are such good questions. Thank you. I'll just talk very explicitly about Freeland. So the process of writing this book was about 10 years, and in that time, I was living my life in what I'll just quote unquote call the free world, even though that's debatable. But I was living my life not incarcerated, right? And I was visiting my then partner who was incarcerated, and so it was just very physically I'm moving in and out of this space that I'm moving in and out of the space that lends itself to this kaleidoscopic sense of like the hyper personal, the hyper intimate, which is constantly being surveilled. And then I would leave and I would go. I lived in multiple states throughout the course of this writing and the course of the book. I mean, all the things that I did and ventured into while he was and still is in the same prison. And, I would leave and I would, do my research, and I, would get a master's in criminal justice policy, which is, I don't believe in criminal justice policy, I'll just say. So I guess just the literal act of the hyper physicality and intimacy of our visits, and then you just leave. And yes, we would talk on the phone in the 15-minute increments, where then he'd have to call back and pay the money, but it was very sort of divided into like the times that we would experience together, and then the times that I would be at school at NYU and thinking very theoretically about this. That there's a in one of the poems I write, sort of before I loved you, I thought the body or the mind a prison, and the body Foucault's panopticon. But now I know, like, you have to wait maybe 3 hours to pee if you want to go. So it's like just this reminder of the, just a reminder of the space between, if one lets that get too big or stops acknowledging it.
That those are interesting reflections. And the question was about the public and
The personal.
the personal. Well, I think the major thing that have felt has been a responsibility to understand the biographies, the histories of the people that I'm writing about to the best of my ability. And to also understand that to the best of my ability may mean to the best that research has available at the time. Like, I didn't know when Monia Lewis died, where she died. I didn't even know she spent her last years, because it was almost unknown. But I did try to get everything else. I try and understand her life, and I try to understand the lives of the people. And I also try to include the research, or make the research that I accessed available to the reader. In other words, that's why I have a bibliography at the back of my books, because
Yeah.
also I know people are like, that didn't happen.
Tyehimba made that up.
Made that up. No, I didn't. This is as best as we can understand documented history.
Yeah.
And so I do feel that responsibility, and many times I have written in persona, and in that way the personal blends very, very, very much with there really is no real separation between the personal and the.
So would you say that you make that research more transparent by providing information in the back, so that the reader can also see how much imagination went into that, so that kind of tension is a little bit more transparent, or not? Is that a part of the
to see, for them to understand that this is an imagination around true events.
Yeah.
For the most part, and that and also, to give the historians some credit, because they put a lot of energy into their work. So it is for those reasons. Yeah.
I mean, I think for me, that's a limitation of getting the news from poetry,
Yeah.
is that, like, I do at the end of the day write fiction. I start with fact, I start with my life, but then the art makes its demands, right? And I have to fit within. I view myself as a narrative poet, so I have to fit within a narrative structure. I have to fit within a metaphorical and a magistic structure as well.
Yeah.
And so there's always this negotiation of creating a sense of authenticity, right? Of creating an authentic replication of an experience and of an emotional experience, sort of finding an emotional truth. But some of exactly what happened gets fudged or embellished, left out.
Yeah.
Like, the Houston bar situation was much more tense than that poem. Like,
Yeah.
there was a standoff. Like, boyfriend wasn't waiting at the bar with a gin and tonic. But I just that would have made the poem too hot, so I left it out.
Yeah, get it. Let me see if I can squeeze in two more questions, not poems. I'm thinking
I did want to
questions are poems. No, they're not.
interject.
Go ahead.
Leigh said something about the archive of the body.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a very interesting comment. And it gives our personal experience. It makes the body a kind of. It makes it the archive. It makes it the holder of scars, the that hold these stories, the holder of ailments that change the body and inform the way that we move through the world, and in that way connect with other people's very basic human experience. I thought that was very, very interesting.
I mean, I think in our bodies you can see entire histories of human migration.
Exactly.
Right. And for me, entire histories of colonization,
Right.
the Vikings colonizing England, who colonized
What do you
Scotland.
Viking in the woodpile?
Yeah. Thanks. I think that poem is funny, but I don't know.
I like that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think when you look at me, whether or not you recognize it, uh, you're seeing some, you're seeing a history, you're seeing American history in a lot of ways, and pre-American history, and some of that history is lost even to me. Like the DNA test that my mother got was like, it was enlightening. It's like the only way I have of knowing where that part of me came from, right? And then I think also like our bodies just react to things in ways we don't understand in the moment because of the histories that they have.
That's true.
They have, right? Like I think we hold that generational stress, trauma, worry inside of us.
That's very true. Yeah.
What about this other body? We have the historical records, right?
Yeah.
And then we have the human body, right, as a kind of a record of its own. And what about if we look at the poem, the form of the poem as a body? How did the three, because it's also interesting, all your collections, like the form is important, obviously. The way that the poem looks on the page, the way it is constrained, the way it makes us read differently, or the way that the visual, how do the three work together for you, and how much does that visual aspect of the form give information?
My background before and still during before I became disabled, I'm a dancer and a performance artist, and that's where most of my training was for 25 years. And I think a lot of that integration and the question of sort of form, content, structure, et cetera, feels very uh, subconscious, perhaps. And of course, there's like a lot of very intentional work. But I think one word that really sort of covered those elements throughout Freeland is this idea of boundary. And I was really obsessed with this idea of boundary, and this idea of boundary that is both like boundary can be like skin, like the end of one body and the beginning of another, and how necessary it's, or not even necessary, but how inevitable that is. That is just reality. Like one body ends and another body begins, and how devastating that was and is and can be. But then also the boundary of the prison, I mean, the very literal boundary of the prison and the human design of that, and how it's like, well, we created that. We meaning, the people created that. This was not, a mountain from that arose, that we made this. And then thinking of boundary also for me, coming back to the book, is the boundary of the book and the boundary of the page. And this is a little bit what we were talking about of printing, but also like recording. But something also felt really difficult to me about, for whatever reason, we have 8.5 by 11 sheets is the standard, and then like books have another standard of like 6 by 9, or whatever. There's some changes, and something I really admire about especially Olio is the playing with their just resistance of that, but that understanding that like my writing, I'll just speak for myself, my writing is dictated to some extent, probably a large extent, by the material reality of what is standard. And so just thinking of all those levels of boundary has just been really important. And I guess I don't have any answers. They're just always questions. And there's always a tension or resistance there.
I think for that reason, those boundaries and forms are human made and like received.
Received. Thank you.
I think that I find the forms very political, and I've come to realize the more I write that like the forms that the ascendancy of British English language poetry, British poetry, matches the ascendancy of the British Empire. The ascendancy of American poetry matches the ascendancy of American empire, right? And so to write those forms that I've received, I have to recognize that. I'm not willing to completely throw them out. I think there's a lot of humanity and a lot of value there, but I have to be able to hold up two things at once. That there was exploitation happening, and there was this human desire to understand our own condition. But what is exciting to me about contemporary American poetry is the amount of formal innovation. And what was exciting for me about writing this book was playing with form and resisting in the way that you were mentioning those forms, and writing back against those histories of empire that I see within poetry and how it's transmitted from generation to generation.
Cool. If you can have one more question. I want to end by asking what questions you still have about history or record or responsibility, and the questions that you're maybe not done yet with, that are still ongoing, and you might be working on or thinking about working on.
There's so many. So many of those questions, aren't there? I'm thinking about. I'm thinking a lot about that late 19th century history, which is still revealing itself in different kinds of ways. I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about the way that I have to speak in particular with the Black literary experience. We've never, this is true for all the American experience. We've experienced the empire in ascent, and now we're about to experience it in decline. What does that look like? What is that going to look like as these various institutions, I'm pretty sure, are going to be destabilized. They've already been let's say, been proven fallible in so many directions, from the banking system to the dollar, to frankly the universities, in different kinds of ways, and definitely the government. What is it going to look like? I think that's a question I have now. And how do we, and is it possible to envision what that looks like by looking at the history that we've experienced thus far? I don't know.
As a child of the Cold War, I have this memory that like nothing happened when I was a kid. And I know that's not true, right? But I'm like, starting with like the fall of the Berlin Wall, I've been very aware that like capital H history is happening in my life. And in the last couple of months, I've been very aware of that capital H history is like happening now. And like, how do we contend with that? I think something that I'm thinking about is like, I've written poems, and the title poem for this collection was written about George Floyd's murder. And I wrote it with the hopes that like maybe we could learn. That for me, literature is not going to affect how we act right now, but it's like maybe future generations can learn from this and like not repeat our mistakes. But now George Floyd was killed by the state in Minneapolis, and now this year 2 people are killed by the state in Minneapolis, and like that poem seems ineffectual to me. Like, how this keeps happening. We keep touching the stove. Like, how does poetry move forward if it's not preventing injustice and preventing humans from moving towards atrocity and
But at the same time, it is a record of consciousness.
Yeah.
And that is a very important thing not to lose sight of. It's because I hear you. I hear you. I remember there was Haki wrote a poem back in the day. I don't know if you're familiar with Haki Madhubuti, but he had a line that said, "I ain't never seen no." I'm paraphrasing. I ain't seen no stanza stop a tank.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, that fucked me up for us.
That's a
Damn, why am I writing, yo?
Yeah.
that's
Changed my major and everything. but here I am doing this thing, and I think that we are, when we're writing about the history, we are becoming part of the history and part of the
Yeah.
record of the consciousness of that history and and shaping our understanding, future generations' understanding of what that meant to us. And I think that that's a critical thing, and we become part of the archive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say I know. Wait, please wrap up. Please wrap up. But I think what we, I struggle with the idea of like, in some ways, I don't necessarily think a writer or artist is responsible for or to anything besides believing in one's work. And on a very personal level, I am a white poet inhabiting some areas of great privilege, and that means I feel compelled to write about, for example, carcerality while naming my identity and positionality, because especially in this specific subject or content, it is not assumed that people who look like me or speak like me are dealing with prison in any way. And so, just in that sort of, in terms of just what are we thinking about and what are we working on, is that feels important to be, for me to speak more about whiteness and whiteness in spaces where it is sort of assumed that whiteness doesn't inhabit, and thus because of white supremacy, those places are invisibilized. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
So,
That was a great talk.